Good morning, all, and welcome. My name is Sarah McKay, and I am Assistant Curator of Prints, Drawings, and Photographs in the Department of Works on Paper here at the Fine Arts Museums. It is my pleasure to welcome you to Free Saturdays at the de Young. Supported by the Curator Foundation and Wells Fargo, Free Saturdays at the Fine Arts Museums offers free admission to all Bay Area residents and free programs to all, creating a space where our Bay Area roots can merge through expression and creativity. It seems fitting, then, that we have gathered here today to celebrate the legacy of Ansel Adams, a renowned photographer born and raised in San Francisco and present-day Seacliff. Among his many achievements, Adams' first solo museum exhibition was here at the de Young Museum in 1932. We are therefore delighted to be partnering with the Museum of Fine Arts Boston to give Adams a warm welcome home through the realization of Ansel Adams in Our Time, which opens to the public today here at the de Young. I would also like to thank Associate Curator of American Paintings, Lauren Palmore, who cannot be here this afternoon, for her enthusiasm and dedication to this project. With this, I am pleased to introduce the originating curator of the exhibition, Karen Haas, who will share a brief introduction to the show. Since 2001, Karen has been Lane Senior Curator of Photographs at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston. Before joining the MFA, Karen held various curatorial positions in museums and private collections, including the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, the Boston University Art Gallery, and the Addison Gallery of American Art in Andover. As senior curator of the Lane Collection, Karen oversees more than 6,000 prints that span the entire history of Western photography, including a significant collection of American modernist photographers, and one of the largest repositories of photographs by Ansel Adams, which includes over 450 prints acquired by Sandra B. Lane and William H. Lane directly from the artist. Throughout her time as curator, she has organized exhibitions such as Make Believe, Unexpected Families, Charles Sheeler from Doylestown to Detroit, Imogen Cunningham in Focus, Gordon Parks Back to Fort Scott, Edward Weston, Leaves of Grass, and Bruce Davidson, East 100th Street. While installing this exhibition, Karen and I shared many enlightening conversations about Adams' technical innovations, his near-spiritual connection to the Western landscape, his environmental advocacy, and the many ways contemporary photographers grapple with his legacy today. I am confident that what is to follow will be equally as enriching. Thank you again for joining us for the public opening day of Ansel Adams in Our Time, and please join me in welcoming Karen Haas.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's really, really nice to be here. I'm Karen Haas, Lane Senior Curator of Photographs at the MFA Boston, and I'm so happy today to have the opportunity to talk with three of the more than 20 contemporary artists in the Ansel Adams in Our Time exhibition. Binh, Meghann, and Lucas, thank you so much for coming today. This is great. With this exhibition, as Sarah mentioned, the MFA Boston celebrated the gift of more than, I didn't even move to my first slide, sorry. With this exhibition, the MFA Boston celebrated the gift of more than 450 Ansel Adams photographs acquired directly from William H. and Sandra B. Lane, collectors, Boston area collectors who collected the work directly from the artist in the 1960s and 70s. The very deep and very personal nature of the collection really allowed us to show another side of this well-known artist. And my hope is that for those of you who haven't seen the show yet, that people will really feel surprise and excitement around maybe the variety in this exhibition. For me, it was a really daunting project. My first reaction when my director said, let's do an Ansel Adams show, as directors will. What can be said is new about this artist? What can we possibly say that's new? And I soon realized that the great opportunity to bring the conversation around this artist forward in time. And it seems to me that is really the responsibility of a curator working today, to respond to current events and current issues, but to not do so in a knee-jerk sort of automatic way. And that's really where the contemporary artists in the exhibition come in. My goal was to delve into the legacy of this really iconic figure who was both an artist and an environmental activist at a moment in time when we find ourselves really undoing so many of the protections that have been put into place, some of them with his involvement, Ansel Adams's involvement. Every day, I think, we all can agree we are witnessing the devastating impacts of climate change firsthand and in the news, feeling overwhelmed and even paralyzed. So I thought this really was, in a funny way, once I got over the, what can I say that's new, once I realized how I wanted to sort of approach this subject, I realized this really was, in some ways, the perfect moment. Ansel Adams is an artist who I would argue has literally come to define the genre of Western landscape photography. I've had a couple of the photographers even describe him sort of as like the 500-pound gorilla in the room. You have to respond to his work. You don't have to even revere it. You have to react to it. You have to understand it. It's sort of the jumping off place, I think, for many people doing this kind of work. So I thought it would be interesting to reconsider his photography in this exhibition through the lens of these contemporary artists working in some of the same places and tackling some of the same very pressing human, environmental issues of our day. Things like land and water rights, the impact of forest fires, mining and the creation and consumption of energy, urban sprawl, and global warming. Here I'm showing you one of the wonderful portraits that Imogen Cunningham did of her friend Ansel Adams in Yosemite, his home place. This sort of classic heroicizing portrait by a fellow F-64 photographer. Yosemite was the place, of course, where Ansel first took up the camera as a 14-year-old and returned virtually every year of his life for the rest of his life. The place where he really found himself as an artist. But I also love this portrait of Ansel Adams by his friend Cedric Wright, taken by a fellow photographer who was with him. If you've seen the show, there's a wonderful film of the climb up to make the monolith face of Half Dome in 1927. Cedric Wright was with him that day, and he was with him the day he made Moonrise Hernandez in 1944. So there for many of the major occasions of Adams's life. But this picture for me really shows the lengths that Adams went to, this sort of inventiveness and ingenuity he had for finding a way. If you've been to Yosemite, you know that many of the views that we see by him were made from something really that is a turnout off, it's basically a parking lot. And the way to avoid the view of the pavement or the people was to, raise himself on this homemade platform on his car. So this is the side of Ansel Adams that I also wanted to represent in finding a more balanced way to consider this artist who's often treated as a kind of standalone figure, as this phoenix-like character, somehow not influenced by other people, not influencing other people, and sort of, unpack that a little bit. So pairing him with photographers active today, hoping to set up a kind of dual conversation between his work and that of a new generation of artists like Binh Danh, for example, who is done a lot of work in the national parks and who we'll look at in a minute, who in many of his pictures is very consciously including the people and the cars and the signs of tourism that, for example, Ansel Adams was actively trying to erase in much of his work. I think since our conversation this afternoon revolves around the power of the landscape, I also wanted to just point out that there are a number of 19th century works in the exhibition, and that I think it's important to mention Adams's earliest influences and inspirations. He was very quick to credit figures like Watkins, O'Sullivan, Muybridge, Haynes, all of whom are in the show. These pioneering 19th century photographers who were working with massive cameras, portable darkroom tents, mule trains, all of these really, massive, huge glass plate negatives, wet plate collodion, all of those challenges. But making photographs like this one that Adams was certainly aware of and very much inspired by. But also, these are the sorts of pictures it's important to remember that were made by the first white photographers in the white men entering the park and using their cameras to record this space, but also making their way back east in the form of stereo cards, of engravings in magazines and newspapers, and in the form of 3D stereo cards. I said that already, sorry, but also mounted and presented in deluxe albums. In the case of Carlton Watkins, that made its way to the attention of Lincoln and Congress, who then made the decision at the height of the Civil War to set aside Yosemite as protected land. That was the kind of capacity of photography to sway opinion that was not lost on Ansel Adams. And I just wanted to remind us all of that. Just show this quickly to say I had no idea when I began this project whether the contemporary photographers whose work I chose would be interested in taking part in this conversation. I really had no idea. And I was really thrilled at the 100% buy-in by all the artists that I invited to take part, and really excited by the conversations that came out of this whole ongoing relationship that we now have, having taken the show to a couple different venues. And I just want to show this work to say what warms a curator's heart is when they're working on one artist and they have a moment, these epiphanies, these wonderful moments where talking to another artist working today, and they realize that, and you realize that they have been looking at that same artist's work, and whether they're loving it or hating it or reacting against it, whatever, but that they're quoting from it in a kind of interesting way. And both Meghann and Lucas, I think, reference the Ansel Adams surf sequence, whether knowingly or not. I think in the case of Lucas, very consciously, he would say. And really, I think those kinds of conversations and putting those works side by side in conversation has been really the highlight for me of this whole project. And I just want to end by saying, little did I know when I first considered this exhibition that it would resonate really so powerfully or feel quite so topical for all of us today, or that Adams's advocacy for the land would take on the increasing urgency that it has for so many of us. But perhaps it will be the work of contemporary artists like these three today and the others in the show that further can open our eyes to the connection between human behavior and climate change and help lead us to a better understanding of the natural environment and our place in it. And that's certainly my hope. Thank you. I think we're going to start with Binh.
Hello, I'm Binh Danh. I'm going to actually just set a timer to respect the time. So thank you for having me. I borrowed the term self-landing from aviation. So the title of my talk is Self-Landing, Daguerreotypes on the Western Landscape. And as a photographer interested in landscape, I'm asking how the self relates to the land. I was born in Vietnam. So when I was growing up, I watched a lot of Vietnam War movies in my parents' TV repair shop. And in both the Hollywood and the real war photographs, I witnessed the horrific image of a war on the land and body. Vietnam for me was a lush green landscape torn apart by war. And when I became an artist, an art student, my pondering of the legacy of the Vietnam War deepened it. And I started collecting cultural materials such as these Life magazine here as a way to sort of understand the war in its elemental ways and that I didn't get through the moving imageries or the encyclopedias at that time. So just moving forward, in 2009, I landed a teaching job at Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia. And it was the first time I was exposed to the South, where I started experimenting with the daguerre process for a project of photographing the Southern landscape. I was fascinated with the American Civil War, and I was looking at works by Alexander Garner, which did not depict the heroic war, we see in fictionalized painting commemorating past wars. This photo is called A Harvest of Death, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Instead, 19th century photographers came in when the battles were over. It makes sense because their equipment was slow and couldn't capture war in action. So these early war photographers document the brutality of war in its stillness. So I made a daguerreotype on the right. It was known as the Jackson Stonewall Memorial Cemetery, and in 2020, it was renamed as the Oak Grove Cemetery. So after a year in Virginia, coming back to the Bay Area, the California landscape became new to me, and I had this idea to set out to photograph Yosemite with the daguerreotype process. So like Carlton Walken, here in the upper left-hand corner, I assembled my equipment and headed into the forest with a photographic darkroom on wheels that I call Louis, after Louis Daguerre himself, the French inventor of the daguerreotype process in 1839. And it took years for me to understand this process, but I kept arriving at parts after parts. This image is a daguerreotype of the Roosevelt Arch at the north entrance to Yellowstone. And I waited several hours so the sun to illuminate the quote on the entrance. So on the top of the arch, it's inscribed with a quote from the Organic Act of 1872, the legislation which created Yellowstone. And so it says, for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. So the full quote is, the Yellowstone Park is something absolutely unique in the world. This park was created and is now administrated for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. It is the property of Uncle Sam and therefore of us. So I always thought that quote at the end is the property of Uncle Sam. It's kind of interesting. So moving forward, so when the daguerreotype came out in the 1840s, it was the only practical form of photography, and it was popular in making portraiture work and became the bread and butter of the new photographic profession. And there were thousands of daguerreotype studios across the United States. And some daguerreotypes became known for their work as fine art, like the studio team Softworks and Hogs. But I wanted to see what happened when you turn the camera to the land, like in this El Capitan picture here. And since the plate that goes into the camera is also the photograph, you will get a high resolution, one-of-a-kind photographic object. In the early years of this medium, people couldn't understand how it was possible to get that many details into an image. And photography was actually a new form of representation. It was hard to wrap one's head around the idea that a camera, a skira, could record a photographic image. And because each photograph is unique and unreproducible, you never record the same image twice. And the daguerreotype does not represent reality the way we see it. And when I'm out there photographing the parts, I base my composition on the memories of these early photographers I have seen, early photographs I have seen, like those by Carlton Walken, Edward Muybridge, as well as Ansel Adams, and many other photographers who came before me. These photographers define the American landscape, the forefather of the American landscape, and who really shaped the visual culture of public land. But I often wonder what were the politics of these photographers. And for me, my daguerreotype mimicked the Civil War era. The question is, what does it do to the image? When I'm using a 19th century process, the photographs started to look very 19th century too. So after the American Civil War, many landscape photographers working for the Matthew Brady studio in DC beginning publishing photographs of war. But then different types of photographs had begun circulating from photographers in the West, like those of Watkins and Moorbridge. And as Karen mentioned, those photographs find their way to Abraham Lincoln's desk, and which is the treaty, not the treaty, but the legislation signed it to give Yosemite Valley to the state of California, upon the expression condition that the premise shall be held for public use, resort, and recreation. And in a lot of these pictures, and of course, thinking about Emerson, which in Emerson talks about landscape paintings or artists and landscape, where a lot of imagery is about reflections. The symbolism reflection kind of appears. So this is kind of a note to that in this picture of three brothers. And I also want to share other landscape daguerreotypes, not part of the national park. And this is Shoshone Fall in Idaho. It was first photographed by Timothy O'Sullivan in 1868. And after the Civil War, O'Sullivan would spend years traveling as a photographer for the Geological and Survey at the request of the U.S. government to document parts of the vast landscape continent, and all sponsored by the U.S. War Department. Now we call that the U.S. Department of Defense. So that idea of war is also embedded in these photographic imageries of early 19th century photographer. This is Spiral Jetty in Utah. And this is Newspaper Rock Historical Monument in Utah. And these petroglyph carvings at Newspaper Rock were made around 2,000 years ago by many native people of the land in the Pueblo cultures around that area. This is a view of Tulalila Falls and Oshanidi Dam. Construction of dam started in 1919 and was finished in 1923, with the first water delivered in 1934. Of course, Hetchi represent the first great environmental controversy in the U.S., and debate over the dam and reservoir continues today. This is the San Francisco City Hall, constructed in 1915. And I wasn't too aware of how this picture will turn out when I clicked my shutter that day. And the bodies spread across the lawn kind of, for me, represent that photograph by Alexander Gardner, A Harvest of Death. But these are just people sleeping on the lawn. And this is the Holocaust Memorial, The Legend of Honor by George Segal. This is Trinity Site, located at the White Sand National Monument in New Mexico, where the first atomic bomb was tested on July 16, 1945. And the Park Service commemorates this place with the obelisk that marked the center of the explosion. And this is the replica of Fat Man, the plutonium bomb that was dropped on the Japanese city of Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. This obelisk is at the Manzanar National Historical Site in the Owens Valley in California. And we all know about the concentration camps that were set up after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. So just thinking about the word camp, concentration camp, re-education camp, refugee camp, prison camp. And this is my last slide. This is Joshua Tree. And in this photo, I'm thinking about how this rock is balanced into this formation and how it's there for like thousands and thousands of years, maybe probably more than that. And comparing and thinking about how can this country balance itself too. So thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. I'd like to echo the sentiments and salutations expressed thus far, thanking everyone who's made this happen, and it's really wonderful to be part of the show. So I've been in a working relationship collaborating with water and the environment for over a decade now. And I'm using a process that I first discovered while working at the Headland Center for the Arts, a new way to work with cyanotype. I collaborate with waves, rain, fog, rivers, lakes, ice, and generally the environment around me. This piece is called a tidal chart, and this work evolved in response to the tides of the San Francisco Bay. So each day of the exhibition, an element was removed from the wall and cut to represent the bay's highest and lowest tides and replaced. So here you see day 1, day 13, day 24, and so on. As the work progresses throughout the exhibition, you can see that it's changing. And with this piece, I was thinking about these larger cycles that are going on around us as we live our lives, and we have our hopes and our dreams and our exhibitions and our highs and our lows and these big life events. And all the while, the moon conspires with the ocean and the tides continue their cycle. My cyanotype work arose from two main impulses, and the first was to make work about the complicated relationship between humans and our environment, and the second was to do it in a way that I hadn't seen it done before. And so I began taking cyanotype material out into the landscape and directly immersing it. I call the series Literal Drift, and literal drift is a geologic term that describes how waves shape the land in their ever-evolving dance. It's a wild process with gain and loss along the shoreline, and it's both something that we can witness and it's something that is happening that is radically beyond our control. So it's immediate and it's over geologic time. This is a two-sided piece from Literal Drift, and I made this on the icy edges of Lake Michigan on a day when the temperature was going above and below freezing. And the work is quite literal and physical, with the specifics of place really imprinting into the surface of the paper and leaving these different kinds of markers of process. So I think of these pieces as really fingerprints of each moment and each location, and so their titles are full of information about how the piece came to be. As my thinking with this work evolved, I began a sister series called Waters of the Americas, where I started working in landscapes that were impacted by human interventions, such as industry, climate change, terrascaping, etc. So this is a piece made at the Great Salt Lake, which I'm glad to see referenced in Ben's work as well. It's a fascinating body of water that is currently experiencing record low water levels, and it's a body of water that we quite literally divided in two with a railroad causeway. And the result of that is we have created two discrete lakes with different bacterial content, different mineral kind of content and behavior where there previously was one. This is a piece from Waters of the Americas made during fire season where ash was raining down from the sky while I was printing. And I was thinking about ash as the burned bodies of trees and the landscape and animals. And so it's this sacred dust in a way of these beings reuniting with the earth through their passing. Of course, we cannot talk about our involvement with the environment without self-implicating, and so I went to the waters most deeply impacted by photography, working just outside of Kodak's former plant in Rochester, New York. I made work at the confluence of the Genesee River and Lake Ontario. Here's a picture of me working there. It was utterly wild and freezing and uncomfortable, and I confess that I felt that the experience of working with those waters, that I was getting some sense of the impact, that kind of like aggression and rage of the natural environment trying to push back on all of the collective impacts that we've had on it. In this next series that I call Ecotone, I collaborate with precipitation rather than surface water. So an ecotone, by definition, is a meeting place of habitats that humans consider distinct. And that's a human construct, a way to delineate the Earth into categories to help us understand it. It doesn't reflect the actual way that the Earth is, but it's a useful way for us to navigate our experience. And I chose this word for this series because it points to our current moment in geologic time, which we're calling the Anthropocene, where human activity has surpassed water in terms of shaping the earth. So it used to be that water was the primary carver of the earth, and now human activity is the primary carver and shaper of the planetary surface. Cynthia Barnett, author of a book called Rain, describes shifting rainfall patterns as the first tremors of a changing planet. This piece is made in a storm that, because of its duration and its intensity, washed away the majority of the photographic chemistry from the piece. I made this piece during a record high rainfall season, which came on the heels of the driest season we had on record for summer, when even the rainforests caught on fire. This next series is called Ice, and with it, I'm collaborating with ice and snow. And like my other cyanotypes, it involves a direct engagement with the environment. This work in particular engaged me because on a microscopic level, water is responding as it's freezing to all the conditions around it. So things like temperature and humidity. But then it's also responding to interventions that occur while I'm printing. So if a piece of my hair falls out on the paper, if a rock lands on the paper, all of these different little surface interventions are shaping and determining how the crystals form and revealing this inner working of water and the structure, the molecular structure of how water freezes. Water molecules slowing down and freezing come together in a very geometric and kind of feathery, beautiful way. Water molecules speeding up and melting are messy, inorganic, and runny. Ice is both incredibly fragile and has the capacity to be incredibly strong. It heals and it injures. I think about glaciers and their monumental nature, and how I always, as a child, thought of them as being static. And of course, I learned that glaciers are moving, albeit typically very slowly. And then in recent history, what we've seen is a rapid change in our glaciers. And that has really shifted my sense of time, seeing the acceleration of a geologic process occurring over a human timescale. Ultimately, my work seeks connection with the environment, and I see connection as the first step in a balanced relationship. I see a distressed ecosystem, and I see the possibility of humans adapting in order to create a more sustainable future. A lot of this ice work has been made over the last several years, which has been a massive period of collective grief. And yet, in the prints, I find ice holding a quality of resiliency, and I find the beauty that I see in these pictures holding a quality of possibility. So just over 3 years ago, Washington State, where I live, asked us all to stay home. And on that day, I started a one-a-day in my garden, where I was placing a piece of cyanotype paper in the garden in the same spot. And you're seeing about the first 2 months of those pieces right here. I had no idea how long the piece might go. I think we were all in a pretty similar place then, but I just started marking those strange days and trying to find a way to record what was happening. And it's been really fascinating to watch the work evolve, because while it was rooted in the pandemic, it's become so much more about time for me. And the piece is actually called "This is What Time Looks Like." This is an example of how it might be exhibited, wrapping around a gallery space so that the viewer walks by these pieces and engages each day the way we sort of moved through each day of this collective global difficulty that we've had. And again, all the while, with everything that was going on, the sun was shining, the rain was falling, the slugs were climbing across my prints and leaving these shimmery trails, and the prints really saw it all. Good news, this piece is going to stop on May 11th when the federal public health emergency is set to expire, and we will be 1,144 days in. And next slide, here we go. Deliquesce is a series of paintings that I am making in collaboration with precipitation and with ink from an edible mushroom called Caprinus comatus. A substance that deliquesces draws so much water into its body from the environment around it that it dissolves itself. In this case, the mushrooms deliquesce and produce a spore-laden ink with which I then paint outside in the environment. After moving to a rural island several years ago, my family and I got really invested in foraging, and that's a practice that requires an alignment with the environmental cycles. And I observed fungi as these great agents of decay. They were disassembling that which was dead and then transforming it into things like nutrients and these essential outcomes that we need to have rejuvenation of our forests and of our ecosystems. The fungi's mycelial network, which is akin to roots, it connects the forest and it transmits nutrients between different trees. And those are the same trees that these fungi will eventually decay. Ultimately, this series of paintings is an offering for those who might possess them in the future. In case of need, these spore-laden paintings can be sown into the land and nourished and cultivated for the purposes of mycoremediation or for the purposes of generating food, or much more romantically, and my most hopeful outcome, for the purposes of generating art for ink for future artists. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here and really special to be among friends. So, photography for me is a language that I can use to describe this complex world. I think describing this world is important because it's on fire and it's urgent, and many parts of it are still beautiful. My favorite photographs feel both clear and inexplicable. They imply as much as they describe. Today, I'm going to show a selection from two different projects. For my series, Human Nature, I spent 10 years making photographs about our current relationship with wild places. Here, Kate participates in a neuroscience study measuring how time in nature benefits mental health. The EEG cap is recording her brain activity as she sits by a river in rural Utah. And Esme swims in the balcony pool of a hotel in Singapore as rush hour traffic builds on the road below her. Singapore recently passed a law where buildings need to create twice as much green space as there would be if the land was wild. At this agricultural experiment station in New York, where I grew up, scientists are crossbreeding domesticated crops with their wild relatives, so our food can survive today's droughts, heat waves, and freezes. Kenzie, a climate scientist, hangs from her safety rope inside a melting glacier. It's in the Juneau ice field in Alaska, and across the world, 75% of our fresh water is stored in glaciers. Which brings me to Ansel Adams' surf sequence from the San Mateo County coast nearby here in California, which he made in 1940. His photographs beautifully captured both the sense of movement and the passage of time. Nature is shown to be precious and pristine and separate from us. I went back to that same beach in 2016 and photographed the government restoring the coastline by moving sand as El Nino waves continued to roll in. In my photograph, and all of my photographs, nature is not separate from people, we're a part of it. A print of this photograph is included in the exhibition that opens here today, which I'm very grateful for. Human Nature was first published in 2017 by Nazreli Press. In the context of so much news focused on disasters, current or impending, I tried to highlight people working towards a more positive future. Here's an installation image from the Traveling Museum exhibition, which started at Foam Photography Museum in Amsterdam. Like Ansel Adams, I gave copies of my photographs to the news to raise awareness, and to NGOs around the world so they could be used in advocacy. That's part of all of my practices and all of my projects. And I'd like to share a piece of a new project. For the past few years, I've been following the world's longest butterfly migration. This is the first time I've ever talked about this series publicly. Painted ladies are the most common butterflies in Europe every summer. Europeans used to believe that they hibernated during the other seasons. This book, which was first published in 1930, was the first to propose that this European butterfly spends most of its time in Africa and the Middle East. Their full migration from Kenya to Finland wasn't mapped until this year. Here is a painted lady butterfly taking shelter in a camel skull in Jordan. I'm also photographing the people and landscapes in the butterfly's path. It surprised me that even after searching through wild places, most of the time I found the butterflies close to people. Here, the Ali sisters walk through Roman ruins in Jordan after immigrating from Syria. Painted lady butterflies have migrated through those fields since before the Roman Empire. Insect tracks on a small section of sand in Morocco. I thought this close-up image looked like an aerial landscape. And this is Gerard Talavera in Catalonia. Gerard is the world's leading expert on painted ladies. He's part of an international group of scientists that just discovered the extent of the migration. Those scientists have been really generous in helping me find the butterflies and also letting me crash on their couches for the past 2 years. It's part of every photographic traveling practice, more or less. A painted lady drinks nectar from a pincushion flower in a Spanish pasture. It was hard for the scientists to predict where the painted ladies would be because the butterflies follow the weather. Climate change means unpredictable droughts and freezes that change when the wildflowers bloom. Because of that, the butterflies survive more now on human-made landscapes. So we found them mostly in people's parks, farms, and gardens. As I traveled, I met many people who had followed a similar path as the painted lady butterflies. Here, Usman works for a farmer in Catalonia picking cherries after immigrating from Senegal. Meanwhile, farmers in Amsterdam protest immigrants and new environmental restrictions to mitigate climate change. And nearby, Ida pauses while watering her flowers. I like the way her hair is styled like the Cupid sculpture above her. Wings from 2 painted lady butterflies, one young and one old. Each butterfly can live up to 5 weeks, flying thousands of miles until its brightly colored wings tear or fade. At the age of 40, I feel kind of in between those 2 sets of wings. Pietro plays with ashes at a nature immersion camp. This is one of the first photographs I made in the project. Now my studio in Berkeley is full of stacks of prints that I'm working on sequencing. I'm going to share just a few more photographs that I've printed recently. A painted lady butterfly flies over the Alps by the Eiger Glacier in Switzerland in late August. They're the fastest butterflies on Earth. Sahila and Alba at the Dead Sea, Israel. A pinned painted lady butterfly at the Natural History Museum in Berlin. First bloom in Jordan. Ureri checking his gun to protect Thomas from elephants and poachers while he looks for butterflies in the Impala Research Center in Kenya. Kelvin holds a painted lady in Kenya. Nana and Adama just after his birth in Mali. And a painted lady wing with a caterpillar in Morocco. I'm interested in this migration because I think it can illustrate the interconnected nature of our world in a way that transcends national borders. it's also fun to be outside in the world following butterflies. So thank you for looking and listening.
Thank you all so much. That was really eye-opening, terrific. So many things that I was not familiar with either, so I hope you all enjoyed that. I'm going to have a very few questions for the artists, and then I hope all of you will have questions that you might like to add, and we can open up to the audience. I wanted to start with you, Ben, and say that one of the things that was so amazing about working on this exhibition for me was, as I said, the Lane collection of Ansel Adams is very interestingly sort of deep and has a lot of work that is actually not the National Parks pictures that most people imagine they're going to see coming to a show of his work. But one of the things, when I did put the National Parks section of the show together, I realized I was so surprised, having finalized the checklist, that all but one of the artists was a first-generation U.S. citizen, new Americans. And I wondered if you could speak at all about the that idea that as a relatively recent, arrival here, that you chose such a maybe stereotypically American subject for your work.
Well, thank you, Karen. Yeah, I think it's a matter of sort of trying to look at imageries of America and trying to relate to them. And I don't know this. Is it my mic? Okay.
I just muted mine. So
Okay. Yeah, it's a matter of just, again, just growing up as a refugee, as an immigrant, and just trying to find my placement within the history of this place and looking through visual culture for that. So it was through all of that exploration that I always, and of course, when I was learning about photography as a student in college, and I started learning about Ansel Adams' work, and his work really paralyzed me because as a young artist, a young photographer, I wanted to photograph the national park, but didn't have the skills to photograph it like the way they're depicted in Adams' photograph. So it wasn't until later, as I mentioned in my talk, knowing the daguerreotype process, that I was able to go to the national park. And then throughout working with this process, start to understand what this process is telling me to do, or telling me basically has a content that's evolving within the reflective surface of the plate.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you don't bring that up, I will, because I had the most incredible experience, having said to a group of people in Boston, this is an artist who came to this country, lived not too far away. You settled not too far away from Yosemite, for example, but never felt that you could see yourself there. And then literally, working with a medium where, as I stood with a group of people and turned and realized I could see myself, I could see all this mix of people along with me. I mean, what a perfect pairing, I think, of impulse or concept and medium. I thought it was ideal. That really just felt so exciting to me.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's the idea that the work, when a viewer looks at these these landscapes so iconic, that they also see themselves. And there's something about reflection when you start to see yourself at that moment in time. You're conscious of yourself. You're no longer looking at the work, but you're looking at that present moment. So there's also that idea too of who you are in this time and space.
And before I let you go, I'd love for you to just say something about one of the things, again, as a photo curator, I'm fascinated by the way you hold on to or you exaggerate even the blue that for a 19th century photographer would have been an artifact. It would have been seen as a mistake, right? That would have been something they would have tried to avoid. And yet you managed to make those beautiful blue skies and waterfalls such a part of what you do. I was really struck seeing your work and then seeing Meghann's work and realizing we had so much blue going on. It was beautiful. But you really have found a way to, it seems to me, exaggerate that in a perfect way.
Yeah, and a lot of time it's also by chance that the blue appears. And the blue happens within the daguerreotype process when the highlights get overexposed. They shift to a blue range. But then it also has this really beautiful quality, especially in skies and water. It's because, you think about how powerful water is and how it's such a life source. And then, of course, the sky has a lot of UV lights in it. And so in that case, it turns blue, too. And it kind of reminds me, again, when I was a kid, learning about the ozone layer, all that UV in the sky and how that layer is supposed to protect us, right? And now it's repairing itself because of protection of products that we don't no longer use, things like that. So, yes.
Thank you. Absolutely. I'm really excited to be able to show more of your work than the 4 pieces in the exhibition. Meghann, I have to say, my first question for you also revolves around process, and yours is so distinctive. You must get a little tired of maybe always talking about the process. But you and Lucas know that I was very anxious to find work to close the exhibition that, at least for me, felt somewhat hopeful, or there was some that we didn't leave feeling just so discouraged by what we've done to the environment. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about something that was completely, I'm embarrassed to admit, completely new to me, which is the dynamic aspect of your cyanotypes, which I find very hopeful.
Sure, yeah. So cyanotypes typically produce a blue and white print. And I just want to mention the color blue is really fascinating to work with it. Blue is what we see in spaces that we can't occupy for any real duration of time, seas and skies, except probably in images. And so I was drawn to cyanotype for that palette and that sort of mystery of that color. But additionally, I learned that cyanotypes, even ones that are done the right way, which is not the way I do it, have the capacity to reduce in extreme UV light. And so Prussian blue is the pigment that occurs once a cyanotype print is exposed to UV light and then washed in water. And you can actually have a bit of reducing to Prussian white in extreme UV light. But then what's kind of incredible about it is with some rest in darkness, you can have a return of the density of the blue. So there's a property of the material that already lends itself toward a dynamism, and it's typically something that we're pushing back against, especially in a museum context or in an exhibition context. You want a stable image. For me, I don't get too tired of talking about impermanence or process because it's so linked to the crux of my work, which is impermanence. And so I elected to use the material because I knew it had this capacity to shift, and then I pushed the inherent qualities of the material and used it in such a way to make my images more dynamic, of course, depending on what conditions they encounter over time. I also just want to do a quick nod to Anna Atkins, who was the first female photographer working in the 1840s with cyanotype, and I saw her work as the earliest relationship between photography and the shoreline. So I started my project Literal Drift actually with a different photographic material, with sea print paper. But then I wanted to tie it back into photography in a way, and it came to me pretty quickly into the process that, Atkins had set the stage where she was pulling specimen from the shoreline and making contact print photograms with them. I could make the shoreline both my subject and my process.
That's perfect. I'm thinking about this idea of things the places we can't go. It's all being blue. So the other thing that I have to say is that I was really excited to include a number of artists like Meghann, like Chris McCaw, a number of artists who really have given over this idea of control that Ansel Adams is so well known for, the idea that he was such a technician, his darkroom, his abilities to, control the print process is so well known. I'm fascinated by this idea that it seems to me, at least, that this giving over of oneself to the process maybe also speaks to this moment in a very interesting way. And I'd love for you to just chat a little bit more about the work you did in Rochester, because that, I think, is very interesting for those of us who, do think about the impacts of the materiality of these objects that we collect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, where Ansel Adams was this incredibly technically proficient photographer, making images of environments that we may or may not be able to accurately call wild. With my work, I really want to receive wildness behaving wildly, and that is the action of collaborating with things that are radically beyond my control and making decisions that are supporting what kind of mark making I can achieve with them. And Kodak is such an interesting company. I mean, for so many of us in the room, it's like beloved Kodak, right? I mean, I grew up shooting their film and using their paper till I switched to Fuji because I needed better blues. But also, y'all have mentioned that photography has the capacity to put protections in place and to shape the way that we create longevity and sustainability in our environment. And at the same time, Kodak created 4 Superfund sites on the east coast of our country. And so it's a really complex dynamic. And when we think about the materials that we're using as artists, there's a movement in eco-materialism to look at how film and photography have impacted the landscape. And while I was working at Rochester, I learned that Mono Lake, which is another place where I've printed, the water that was diverted from Mono Lake to give Los Angeles water was oftentimes being pulled out, for example, to make fake rain scenes, like for Singing in the Rain. And then we were pulling minerals and materials from the Owens Valley, schlepping them across the country to Rochester, where they would use those materials to make film, and then send it back to LA to make movies. So there's this incredibly complicated web of impact occurring throughout the entire nation. But Kodak for me is like emblematic of this issue with which we find ourselves dealing with now.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Lucas, as I said, I was looking for some small rays of hope in the face of all these growing signs that, the climate is steadily worsening, and we're clearly not doing enough to counter that. I am really interested in, I think you maybe more than almost any other artist in the show is working directly with climate scientists. You're looking at very, very specifically the ways that humans interface with nature. And I'd love to just hear you talk about that relationship and that, that decision. Sort of, how did you become that artist who is going to be working that way?
Well, I'm hoping there's a lot more than just me. And I know, but what I'd say is thank you. So I grew up on a small farm in Long Island. My parents are environmental activists. My mother's a storyteller. When I started photographing and I brought my first prints home from the darkroom, and I thought, these are beautiful print. My parents were like, well, what are you going to use it for? What's it about? And I think, at least in my practice, a good photograph is of something, and it's about something, and it's for something. And so, as I've grown up in a certain way, still feel like I'm growing up, I've developed a way of working in my art practice where I collaborate with people who are doing something that I believe in. And then I give them copies of the photographs they can be used. And I don't judge how they use them in terms of the craft of how they're used. They're like on crappy brochures in rural Nevada to fight the toxic waste pond from a gold mine. And then I use the same photographs in galleries, festivals, museums, or public installations. And then the same photographs in news stories. And the constellation of that all comes back to the imagery that I love making and the values that I have as a human in the world. It also just feels fun to collaborate with people. Like it's not all doom and gloom. Like it's like when I was growing up also, the narrative of the environmental movement was like bad stuff's gonna happen. And now the narrative is like bad stuff is happening. And what do we do about it? And that to me feels interesting, that the average environmentalist I meet is solutions oriented, because we've gone beyond the trying to convince in most of the world.
Yeah, I've always been interested in the fact that Marclette talks about being concerned always that, photographing pristine, untouched landscapes, whatever that even means now, creates a situation where what he describes as the wilderness problem, right? That we think about these spaces as something we need to save, and we send our checks and we get involved and we believe in these places, and rightfully so, but then maybe in the process forget about our own sidewalks, our own cities, our own neighbors. And I'm really interested in the way you find a balance between the far-flung and the local. And how does that play out in your work? Is it really just a serendipity, or is it something you're consciously setting out to, chase butterflies?
But that was the inspiration of the Butterfly Project. Mm-hmm. Like if you go around the collection of the de Young and European paintings, you'll see painted lady butterflies reproduced here. Mm-hmm. They're Europe. They were like a symbol of Europe, where my family's from. Mm-hmm. And when I read about the discovery that they weren't European butterflies, that they were intercontinental butterflies that bring pollen and fertilize flowers across the Mediterranean and bring food across the Mediterranean for birds and other parts of the ecosystem, that felt like a metaphor to me when so much environmental dialogue is still local. It's what do we preserve locally? What are we polluting locally? Or then global in a way that's abstract, like climate change is still abstract for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And the literality of butterflies connecting ecosystems and people that we think of as so diverse felt interesting.
Yeah.
And then also, I'm lucky enough to have had now, after doing this for 20-something years, exhibitions in a lot of these places. I have friends, like when I've gone for a show somewhere, I usually make friends. And I get to call them up and say, hey, remember we hung out 5 years ago? Can I come stay with you? Yeah. And then the network of scientists were so Lepidopterists don't get a lot of attention. So they were so excited to host me.
Lepidopterists.
So the combo of community and a cause.
Yeah.
So
great. Well, thank you so much. And I don't know, are we going to be able to turn the lights up and take some questions from the audience? That would be great. Anybody have a question for any of the? Yep. Great.
I got a question to, what's his name? Binh?
Yeah.
The way you process your photography, daguerreotype, how long would it take you to process that thing? It takes hours or days?
Well, I do the photography on site, and it's just a matter of synthesizing a plate, which could take anywhere from 20 minutes, hiking to the location, another maybe 20 minutes. And as Karen's mentioned, all these places in the national park are right next to parking lots, so it makes it very convenient to photograph these amazing scenes. So within that time frame, it could be anywhere like an hour just to make one plate. Yeah.
So it's like, do you overexpose your light meter or?
I don't use a light meter, and I don't carry any other camera with me other than my large format 8x10 camera or sometime a 10x12 camera, because I'm just really focusing on that one camera. And I mainly go with experiences. So I photograph on really bright sunny days, a certain time period, and I know that at f/16 it's going to be anywhere from 45 to a minute exposure. So I kind of just keep that in mind. And of course, working within the elements like that, you can never really plan, right? Because you're going to have the sky is changing really fast, or you're somehow stuck and waiting for a parking spot, and you realize you just missed the light, and then you just have to just there goes the day. So yeah, it's again, as like chasing butterfly. It's definitely. I don't want to say chasing the light because that's sort of Oh, but anyway.
Any other questions from the audience?
Hi, thank you for being here. Did you guys find anything about each other's work that you found either particularly impressive or just neat, or it could be the technique or it could be the message or any of that from each other's work?
Great question.
I'll start. Yeah, well, we've known each other a while. Lucas mentioned something in his presentation that actually Ben and I were just speaking about as we were walking through the gallery, and that was that I'm always looking for language to replace the word nature, because so commonly when people ask me about working with nature, what I discern from their question is that they are thinking of nature and humans, when in fact, right, we are obviously of nature. And so it was refreshing to hear Lucas bring that up, and that sort of inquiry, I think, is running through all of our work in a pretty fascinating way.
Good at me. I was just thinking, again, the idea of human civilization stepping out of nature, which is maybe could be, of course, there's a lot of theories on stone tools and stuff like that, but I'm really thinking about those cave people, the cave painting folks out there, not out there now, but out in the thousands of years ago, and they were painting pictures of nature. It was bison, bison was just animals, and that was sort of like, they have a different relationship to nature than we do today. And maybe that's a problem. How to get back to that part of our primal self.
I'd say we've all known each other long enough that we've kept on making art. And I think part of making art for a long time is finding the part of it that we defend in response to critique or change of taste, change of world. And that piece that's kept the three of us going for as long as we've all known each other is, it to me, is a wonderful rarity and a precious thing. And I'd say each of us have a craft that we've chosen intentionally, and we matched it with a content. Right? So I love being able to see myself in the landscape and imagining you see yourself in that too. And I love the dynamism of your work and how it puts me in a place where you were, and how it can change, and I can bring my own feelings to it. And so to me, what makes an art community a community is diverse work that talks about things I care about and people who I can hang out with. Yeah, just like Hutton Bison. I hope we don't hunt too many more bison, though. It's a bit.
We're done.
Meghann, I'm interested in your workflow on site. Do you have a crew of 100? Do you, these blanket-sized pieces of paper, have you combined the process of exposure and development at the same time? Or do you lug them home and wash them off with the garden hose? What is your process?
I mean, a lot of lugging, for sure. When I saw the picture of your van, I was like, I have a van that I lug my art around in, and I know Lucas used to. So with the large pieces, the grid that I showed early on in the slideshow, typically I try to have at least 3 assistants, but oftentimes more, and there's several people in the room who I've been really fortunate to have assist me in making these large pieces. The thing about working with waves is there's just a huge element of chance and chaos. And so I try to get as many hands on the work as possible. With the grids, I'm taping them together and then I'm backing them for the purposes of the printing session with a tarp. And that doesn't at all guarantee that the piece will stay intact. So the way that you see it on the wall, that's the same orientation in which I took it into the water. So I'm making it in these huge, kind of complicated like puzzles. So I label them alphanumerically, and I assume that at some point a wave will drag away one or more pieces, and part of the assistant's job is to help me regain them. So early on in the process, I had surfers bring prints back to me that had gotten out of hand, and I do thrive in that wildness. My husband said early on that living with me is living in chaos with a dash of control, and I think that's how my work is too. But it's all happening on site except for a curing and drying process, which at that point I need to extract it from the landscape once it has the structural integrity to be moved.
This might make a good reality series.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you all for speaking with us today. I'd love to hear just a little bit more about what Ansel Adams kind of means to you now, and sort of how that's changed maybe from, your earliest moments in your career photographing up to even today being part of this exhibition.
Well, when I was a young photographer, I was a little bit perturbed with how everywhere the work was. And it was like, gosh, why is this person's work like everywhere? And I found myself not really engaging with his work super seriously because I was kind of dismissing it like it was like too popular or something, which is a little bit unfair, but that's what my younger self was thinking. And then I went to the San Francisco Art Institute, and Ansel Adams founded the program that I studied in and where I eventually taught. And so my respect for his impact really shifted as I became more educated around the importance of his work. And then I kind of mentioned this with Karen's question, but work like his with a focus on sort of a like classic technical proficiency has been a springboard for me, something I can push back against, and something that I've felt has enabled me to establish a process that has really a desire to push back against that kind of way of working.
When I started photographing as a teenager, the Ansel Adams photographs of nature were ubiquitous. They're like on the mugs, at the gas station or whatever. And it seemed false to me as an idea of nature, right? Because where I grew up in suburban Long Island, my family's farm was one of the last sections of open land. The woods behind the house are getting developed into suburbs, and those people with those suburban houses would have an Ansel Adams catalog, or a calendar. But now, as the the sort of global narrative has shifted towards a focus on disaster. And a lot of, the average person I meet, if you ask, say, I photograph people in nature, they say, wow, that must be so depressing. And I actually think in that context, Ansel Adams' photographs become an important reminder of the preciousness of a thing. Because in terms of global narrative, we need a sense of paradise to fight for. And so I think it's actually, in my own practice, at first I dismissed it, his work, and now I think it feels more important.
Love the quote that Laura McPhee in the video clip at the end of the exhibition says something about Ansel Adams made her feel as though nature was a worthy topic as an artist too. And I think that's also, just something that maybe is so simple we forget it. And I thought she sort of says it quite beautifully. So thank you all. I think we probably should wrap it up. We'd love for anyone who is interested in staying and having books signed, that people are free to stay and join us for that last piece of the program. But thank you all for coming.